everyone. Welcome to this special program tonight, Green Alliances, Cultivating U.S. and Chinese Climate Leadership on Food and Agriculture. This program is brought to you through a collaboration effort of the Wilson Center and U.S. Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I am the Executive Director of the U.S. Heartland China Association. I will be the moderator today. We are so honored to have two experts with us here today. Jennifer Turner, Director of China Environment Forum from the Wilson Center, and Dr. Karen Mancl, Professor Emerita from the Ohio State University and Wilson Center Fellow. And one thing I'll mention is we are so excited that Jennifer and Karen will be joining the 2024 U.S.-China Agriculture Roundtable that's taking place in China for the first time, even though this is the fourth year. We're going to be going to Shandong and Beijing, and they will be speaking at the Think Tank Dialogue on June 12th, hosted by Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So without further ado, I'm going to super easily actually turn to our speakers to ask each of them to share with you briefly their career highlights that brought them to this event, this report that we're highlighting today. So maybe Dr. Karen Mancl, you can take it away from here.
Thank you, Minfan. So my name is Karen Mancl, and I'm a professor of food, agricultural, and biological engineering at The Ohio State University. And I've been working in rural sanitation for much of my career. And I first traveled to China in 2006 and was working with the Shandong Academy of Agricultural Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and Chinese Agricultural University, those three institutions, on rural sanitation issues in China. And we were able to build some wastewater treatment plants in villages in Shandong. So I returned after my first trip to China was in 2006, and I pretty much returned every year until the pandemic kind of stifled our ability to travel there. I started working with the China Environment Forum in 2019. I joined Jennifer's team in the Wilson Center with the China Environment Forum as an intern, and then went on to work with her on projects. And then we wrote this proposal to really focus in on climate change in agriculture. So this year I'm at the Wilson Center for the whole year as a fellow. So it's just been a real honor to work both in China and in Washington, D.C. on this important issue. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
But I should point out that that Karen's research at the Wilson Center is looking at the history of U.S.-China agricultural exchanges, because you were on one, right, in 2006?
That's right.
Yeah. So she's got the history with ag. Hi everyone. Jennifer Turner. I've been directing the China Environment Forum. It'll be 25 years in the fall. We need to have a party on that. So much of our work, the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy foreign policy think tank in DC, and I think I have the best job in DC because I've had the opportunity over the years to bring together Chinese government, NGO, business, and researchers around all kinds of issues. I came to the Wilson Center as a water policy person, so did a lot on water. But, you know, over the years, I've really developed a lot of expertise in the climate and energy. In some ways, the climate relationship is pretty much in the DNA of my project. But some of you who maybe are familiar with my project might know that in 2010 to 2018, we had a project called Choke Point China, looking at water energy confrontations and what it meant for food. So I have been dabbling with food for quite a few years, but it was with Karen coming as my intern. Fabulous. You should always get an engineer as an intern when you're working on environment. I really saw an opportunity to go more into agriculture. And actually, I'm going to start sharing my slides if that's okay. So because, oops, hold on a second. Let's go back a slide. Back. Okay. So we, as Karen mentioned, we got some funding to do a project that we call Cool Agriculture, that we're looking at what is the greenhouse gas emissions of the agri-food sector. So looking at the whole supply chain, but initially starting with ag in the US and China, and what were opportunities where they could cooperate. Now, thinking of cooperation, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the US and China, had crazy tight relationships around climate change. I mean, we'd cooperated on and off before then, but it really hit its peak in 2009 with the Obama-WHO clean energy agreements. And over the years, during the Obama, it was what I called climate and air quality ping pong, because you have to think China had the bad air pollution problems from coal and cars. And so we had all these working groups. And my favorite was the clean energy research centers that brought together scientists, NGOs, and national laboratories to work together on joint technologies on things from electric vehicles, building energy efficiency. They even did a water and energy technology project based on my choke point work. I mean, it was amazing. It was busy time for me, lots of people coming to town, had lots of projects taking me to China. And the pinnacle, in many ways, even before the Obama left office, was the bilateral climate agreement. And that agreement propelled the world to come together for the Paris Climate Agreement. So, you know, the two biggest greenhouse gas emitters, energy, we're both energy hogs, got to admit it, that, you know, we can be the game-changing country. Now, there were still conflicts at this time. Those of you who are around might remember that there was lots of complaints that we're hearing echoed today about Chinese dumping solar PV panels. But keep in mind, studies have shown the jobs created around solar PV panels, 75% of those jobs are where it's installed. Similarly for wind and others. So, but China's inexpensive / cheap solar PV panels also probably made it possible for the world to even think that we could hit the Paris climate targets, because brought down the price of greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the progress in China, you know, and in the US on climate action was kind of a little bit of, I call it like cooperative competitors. But now, one thing I was struck with, because like when Karen started working with me and we were thinking of what we want to do on ag, and I knew that at a lot of the climate talks that sometimes the issue of food came up, but it was definitely not on the table, which it's highly unfortunate, because 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the world comes from the food and ag sector. So from production to use to disposal. And that's a big bite. And if the world can come together and decrease agri-food emissions, it could really buy us time as we struggle with, you know, some of the clean energy transitions. So the US and China, we are food superpowers, just like we're energy superpowers. And so, you know, in terms of production and consumption, so that's not surprising that the agri-food greenhouse gas emissions are moving on high in both countries. Second largest source in the US comes from agri-food sector. Rice is the big driver, but there's other sources too of greenhouse gas emissions in China. Now, before we go further, you need to be like me and have Karen Mancl teach you a few things about the ag sector in US and China. You ready, Karen?
Yes, indeed.
All right, I will mute myself and flick my slides.
Okay, so we're going to start out with a little quiz.
Sorry.
And you can just mark your answers down. We're not going to collect them. You're not going to get a grade, but we just want to see how you do. So the size of the two countries. Is China bigger than the United States? Is the United States bigger than China? Or are they about the same size? This is the geographical area of the two countries. So that's question number one. Question number two is it's the same kind of answers. The population of China and the United States. Is China's population bigger than the United States? Is the United States bigger than China? Or are they about the same? Now we're going to get a little bit tricky here. Farm size. Are farms, the average farm size in China bigger than the farms in the United States? Or are American farms, the average American farm, bigger than farms in China? Or are they about the same size? And then finally, my last question is farmland per person. Does China have more farmland per person than the United States does? In the United States, do we have more farmland per person than in China, or is it about the same? So now let's look at the answers to see how you did. So in terms of size, the United States and China are about the same size. So they're both pretty big countries and they're about the same geographic area. But but the population is what's really different. And that's in that land area, even though the land area is about the same size, China has 1.4 billion people compared to the United States with only 330 million people. So much bigger. So when you start to look at the farm size, they have so many more farmers. The farm size in China is so much smaller than the United States. The average farm size in the United States is 444 acres. The average farm size in China is only 1.6 acres, kind of almost like a big garden. And then finally, when you start to divide that up over those populations, the area of farmland to grow the food to feed one person in the United States is just under 5,000 square meters, which is about the size of a football field, compared to China, which is under 1,000 square meters, which is about the size of 2 basketball courts. So as you can imagine, our agriculture is pretty different in terms of the size of farms and the pressures to feed so many more people in China than the United States. So the big question that keeps coming at us as we look at U.S. and China is the question of competition. The United States and China, are they competing with each other? So what does that mean? So I looked up the definition of competition, and that the definition is a rivalry where 2 or more parties are striving for a common goal which they cannot share, or where one's gain is another's loss. So only one bird can be at the top of the medal stand there. So that would be a competition. So the question is are we competing in agriculture? Is there a competition between the United States and China in agriculture? So that's a good question. So when you're looking at the things that really drive agricultural policy in China, the 2 major issues that are driving Chinese agricultural policy is, number one, food security, because they have so many people to feed on such a small area of land per person. And also, since much of the poverty is in rural China, agriculture is also looked at as a vehicle to alleviating poverty. So those are the 2 major drivers for rural and agricultural policy. And in fact, this is so important that Xi Jinping has equated food security. It's an important foundation of national security. So why this has really come up recently is when I first went to China in the early 2000s, it was quite remarkable how China could grow enough food to feed itself, even with its very large population. So their food security index was close to 100%, but now it's dropped to less than 70%. So they're really having to look beyond the boundaries of the country in order to get enough food to feed their large population. So what are the drivers of U.S. agricultural policy? Well, it's different than in China because we grow ample food. We're a country of plenty when it comes to growing food. So if you're growing something that's very perishable, and if you don't sell it, it's going to start to start to lose it. It's going to start to rot. So having the ability to sell that food, sell what you grow, so cultivating markets for our agricultural products is a major driver of U.S. agricultural policy. So when you look at U.S. and China, it's really looking at apples and oranges when we're talking about agriculture, that because they want different things out of their agricultural community, they're really not competitors. So this is one area where the United States and China don't compete.
Except we did find catfish as a topic and tilapia. So there's a longer story in that you could ask us about in the Q&A. It's a temporary situation. Anyway, so we're not heavy competitors. We're actually highly interlinked and interconnected in our food sectors. China is the largest importer of our grain, or they're our largest export market for grain. And it's actually a little bit less now. I mean, the soybeans have rebounded, but the rate of growth I mean, it's a little slower than it was the decade before COVID, but still, our markets, in the heartland in particular, really do depend on Chinese purchases. But we do buy food from China, and we made our little cargo ship down below here. And then this is all these photos, the infographics are from our publication that you can hopefully check out. But so we are, and I'll give you a QR code in a hot second. So we are interlinked in our food. We're also interlinked in that both countries are facing, like much of the world, but common climate threats to our food security. Think of the heat wave from hell. We had heat waves from hell 2 summers in a row, and both U.S. and China, they've disrupted agriculture, raising questions on climate resilient crops. Now, as I mentioned, we started this project, Cool Agriculture Project, in September 2022, and in that time, we've produced lots of webinars and blogs in English and Chinese. And the publication that you see on the right, there's a QR code there. You can scan it now. I'll show it at the end. That should take you to our Cool Agriculture webpage. We also have a lot of podcasts. And it was the key questions that we were looking at, again, was what are the greenhouse gas emissions in both countries in terms of agriculture? And then where are opportunities to cooperate? And that we found that kind of, you ready for it? Low-hanging fruit. The whole publication has food puns, but where can we get the most bang for our buck in terms of it's not a competitive area, and also where can we really lower greenhouse gas emissions? And now I'm going to ping pong the screen back to Karen.
Okay, so this picture, it's an old black and white photo, and this photo is actually from the United States in the 1930s, where we created an environmental disaster in the middle of our country called the Dust Bowl, where we abused the soil natural resource, and it started to erode away, and it was devastating to the population of the central part of the United States. So in response, we have developed government policies to better protect our soil, and we created the Soil Conservation Service. So soil was recognized quite early as an opportunity for a focus on environmental protection. So as it turns out, soil is also very important in the climate sector. Soil is the largest reservoir of carbon, and it stores 3 times the amount of carbon that is stored in the plants that are growing in it. And how does the carbon get into the soil? Well, there's this wonderful machine that nature has created called plants that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pull it into the plant and then down into the roots and the plant material. As it decomposes, it becomes part of the organic matter in the soil. So soil is an extremely important area for storing and pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. So the way that farmers can do this is to adopt conservation agricultural practices, things like no-till, things like planting cover crops during the winter so that the soil is never bare, and also adopting integrated soil fertility practices in order to pull more carbon dioxide into and organic matter into the soil and make sure that it stays there. In the United States, because we got started early after that terrible Dust Bowl in terms of adopting conservation agricultural practices, about 30% of our land in the United States, our farmland in the United States, is in conservation agriculture. And in our agricultural policies, we have incentives to encourage farmers to adopt conservation agriculture through Farm Bureau programs called EQIP, and then a brand new program, which is a partnership for climate smart commodities, is a new program that was just launched to encourage more adoption of conservation agriculture. Sadly, in agriculture in China, they're a little bit farther behind, and less than 5% of agricultural land in China is in conservation agriculture. And in one of the big obstacles to adopting this type of agricultural practices, you need different types of equipment. You need a special kind of planter to cut through all that crop residue that's on the surface of the ground. And just buying planters from the United States wasn't going to work for them because their farm sizes are so different. So the Chinese Agricultural University has developed small no-till planters for use in China, and those are starting to get out into the country. So we're hoping to see more adoption of conservation agriculture in the future in China. So this is an area where the two countries can learn from each other and overcome these obstacles to increase storing carbon in the soil and reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
And I'm going to interject here that another area, we just hosted someone from Climate Bond Initiative, and we're having conversations about financing and carbon trading, and that this is an area where the US maybe also is a little ahead, China very interested. How do you measure it? So we see this as, ready for it, a fertile area of cooperation. All right, I'll mute and you go on, Karen.
Okay, a second area where we have a lot of opportunity for collaboration is with rice. Rice is an extremely important crop in the world. Half the world's population, is supported with rice. But sadly, rice is also, of all of the grains, the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. And as it turns out, that when you're growing rice, it emits methane. And it can also emit nitrous oxide. So there are agricultural practices that that you can adopt when you're growing rice to reduce the emissions of methane. But when you use those practices, you can increase the emissions of nitrous oxide. When you're looking at comparing carbon dioxide to methane and nitrous oxide, which are also greenhouse gases, where carbon dioxide is 1, methane would be 80 times more powerful. For nitrous oxide, where carbon dioxide is 1, nitrous oxide would be 300 times more powerful. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're looking at adopting new practices to grow rice. It's kind of as we say, a sticky climate challenge, because if you increase one, you can decrease the other. And you have to be really careful. And it will take the intellectual capacity of our two agricultural scientific communities to really find sensible solutions. The ones that are showing the most promise are some new cultivation practices, which can help to reduce methane emissions while not increasing nitrous oxide emissions. There are also trials going on new varieties of rice that emit less methane, and also improve nitrogen management so that you don't introduce as much, emit as much nitrous oxide. So those are some of the areas of research. Now, when you're looking at comparing the United States and China, China is the big player in the room in terms of producing rice. 208 million tons of rice. The amount of rice that we grow in the United States, which we do, we grow rice in the United States. I think the Chinese could probably eat it up in about 2 weeks. So, but we're both are rice growers. So in the United States, once again, our Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities is investing in the development and promotion of new agricultural practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from rice. In China, they're looking at some other types of agricultural practices. Using plastic mulch is a big technology, a big input into agriculture in China, and plastic mulch shows potential to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in rice. And also aquaponics, which is kind of an old-fashioned type of approach, but it's being brought back as a more integrated way of growing rice and also managing nitrogen.
All right, I get it back now. Boom. Want to say one thing about the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, that it's what's I've been looking at the 150 some plus projects, and we're seeing that it's the USDA is putting out $3.1 billion, giving grants to farmers, companies, nonprofits, often working together to look at both some of the technology, the policy, some of the financing, some of the measurement. It's a very diverse and rich program, and it's something that could offer models for China. I want to tell a quick story about someone who we met as we were doing our research. By chance, Feng Hu from Yunnan University happened to be in DC to receive an award on behalf of his team and his U.S. supporters for developing a perennial rice. Science Magazine declared it, I think it was in 2022, one of the top 5 scientific breakthroughs. You have to think of it, remember Karen said no-till is a good thing? Well, perennial rice, the roots stay in the soil, helps maintain the stability of the soil. I mean, the science is still new, but the Chinese farmers, some of them it's a small percentage, but they're starting to adopt it. The scientists are continuing to study it. They see definite benefits for labor costs, water saving, time for them, but also that they're seeing that there could definitely be a number of climate benefits. And should note that the Land Institute in Kansas, we interviewed them for our podcast, and they told us about Feng Hu and his team. And there's a picture of him where we got to interview him live for our podcast. So you could go to our website and check that out. Now, if you haven't read our publication, spoiler alert, we have a chapter on food waste. And 1/3 of the food that's produced in the world today is wasted every year, wasted and lost. So wasted, well, lost is what happens on the farm, basically from the harvest until it gets to the store. And then waste is what happens in the stores and consumers. So it was very difficult to figure out the data on each of these levels in the US and China. So if some of you out there have better data, please help us out. But we did see some trends. One is that China appears to have pretty high percentage of wastage on the upstream, and that could potentially be a good area for cooperation. I mean, the US, we also have wastage, and it could be increasing. Think in the US, we're having difficulty getting enough labor to pick our food, to harvest it. In China, sometimes their cold chain in terms of delivering food is not good. Can give you more examples later, but one thing that you notice on the far right that, per capita food waste, US and China are kind of neck and neck, but don't worry, America, we are still #1 food wasters in the world. One thing that was kind of exciting is that another area where we found those rice scientists, but we also found some NGOs, US NGOs that are working in China on the issue of food waste. We had people from RARE and WWF come and talk about the work on the picture on the left of the Pride on Our Plates project in China to try to help small and medium restaurants to change their behavior and kind of measure and understand how much they actually were wasting. It's a big sector of waste in both countries. The Pacific Coast Food Waste Cooperative Collaboration Cooperative, that it's these states, as you see, and Canada and the US that have been working together with companies in particular, even hotels, trying to look at what are the kinds of strategies that can be taken to reduce food waste along the supply chain. And WWF and ReFed have led this program. They now have created a national food waste pact. So they're doing a lot of their engagement with companies because there's a lot of wastage that happens even before the consumers get it. So really an interesting kind of model. And we think that there's a lot more maybe similarities of the bottom-up action on food waste. But China we're, I think, the first country in the world that passed an anti-food waste law. So huzzah. The other topic that we explored quite heavily, we jokingly said that for a year that we were the Cow Environment Forum, because we certainly seemed to have a lot of blogs that were coming out and meetings discussing the methane hoofprint of cows. A lot of it comes from the burps. We brought together quite some, both in blogs and on webinars of scientists like at UC Davis, studies for over the years that if you food additives to give cows so they'll burp less and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of scientists in China who are studying this in dairies. So there's a great opportunity to bring the scientific community together on this front as well. Back to the policies. So we've given you some areas. These were our initial areas that we explored: soil, rice, cows, and food waste. But particularly the food waste was the biggie, I thought, as well. What's happening in the bilateral climate relationship? Well, we do know that in 2021 we had the U.S.-China climate crisis statement, the Glasgow Declaration. Got stalled by a lot of political conflicts, geostrategic challenges. But what was striking about this is that in both these documents, for the first time, they mentioned food. And one sentence that said that they would work together on green and climate resilient agriculture. Because remember how, climate resiliency, adaptation, it's big need in both countries, but it opened the door. Now, if you look, please, go read the publication, because you'll see that we give you a little bit more information about how US and China, our agricultural agencies, have been cooperating on a massive number of issues, but climate change hasn't been a major topic. But about a month ago, Secretary Vilsack and Minister Tang came together, and they met, and they're talking about restarting the exchanges that stopped, I think, in 2016 or 17. Karen, you got to correct me on that later. But also they said, they mentioned for the first time that I've seen, to work together on climate smart agriculture. So stay tuned on that. Another thing that's maybe putting kind of wind in the sails of the US and China taking food and climate action is that both countries signed onto the COP28 the COP28 declaration on food and climate. So we have committed ourselves to start taking climate action on food. So we're wrapping up our presentation part here. I want you to take questions. This is please join my network. You could scan that to get more of our pub information and blogs and whatnot on our cool agriculture. And I will take this down. And now we get to talk. Yay.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. I know this report is also available in Chinese, right?
Yes, it's available in Chinese. And a number of our blogs are also in Chinese, and our podcasts, 3 of them are in Chinese. They're not direct translations, but they're on, yeah.
Great.
Fungi Hu is one of them. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to get more out in Chinese. And we want to continue working in the space.
That's excellent. So given your long history or the connection to the climate and agriculture, what surprised you most as you were working on this report that you didn't even know until you were getting ready to publish a report? One thing that really stood out for each of you?
Karen, do you want to go first?
Well, I guess with rice, because there was a lot of talk about methane being generated from rice production, which to me was not a surprise, because methane, the word for methane in Chinese is swamp gas. It translates from Chinese to the word swamp gas. And since you grow rice in wet fields in these rice paddies, it's not a surprise that there would be a lot of methane emission. But when there were developing practices to reduce methane emissions, there was this practice proposed of alternate wetting and drying. Let's let the fields dry out, let oxygen get into the fields, and that would reduce methane emissions. And I said, yes, that indeed will work. But then when you do that, you increase nitrous oxide emissions. I guess that was a big surprise to me, that the big solution that everybody was pointing to and pushing for and developing policies around alternate wetting and drying to reduce methane emissions from rice production was looked at as a simple way to solve this problem, was not so simple. So I think that was probably one of my biggest surprises, was to see that the problems, that there were unintended consequences when you quickly adopt a policy.
I think one thing that I was actually kind of surprised. I mean, yes and no surprise, but fine. When we started looking to find people who worked, I mean, I'd never never went to the dairy before, right? Karen took me actually to a dairy on a university campus. But the fact that we found a lot of scientists who had been working together for years, I mean, particularly on the cow methane issue. I mean, California, they've had a very special relationship with China on climate change for many years now. They have a lot of MOUs. There's, in fact, Governor Newsom was just in China in the fall. You probably heard, came back with, I think, 7 MOUs, and it's all about subnational cooperation. And within that, there are quite a few provinces that were interested in agriculture as part of their climate conversation. And there'll be a subnational climate summit out in California in May before I go to China. So yeah, so it's really exciting. It was exciting for me to see, to create this whole new wing of my mafia, dare I say that. And yeah, so I mean, you see, it's a lot of potential, and I think that, but it is a new area for, you know, it's not part of the full part of, you know, the climate conversation yet, but I think it has a lot of potential. But again, when I talk US-China cooperation, it's not just at the national level. I think the subnational, the states, the cities, the companies, the scientists, and the NGOs.
So one thing I think it's a really very unique opportunity. As you know, you're going to Agriculture Roundtable, and the first stop is Shandong, June 7th through 8th. Shandong is opening its door to American delegates to see their crop production, livestock production, and many other elements of agriculture ecosystem. They actually would much welcome climate smart technology companies and who want to take advantage the potential. As Karen mentioned, China is behind on quite a few fronts to go. So again, if you are attending this event, you know some technology, climate smart service provider who want to explore, just reach out to us and we can see if you can get signed up for that special visit. What we are having question coming in. I'm going to pick actually another question that was shared earlier, which is for the area you pointed out, where do you see what the next step of collaboration might look like? For example, around whether it's soil or whether it's around waste. So how do you envision that might move forward in the next year or two?
Do you want me to
Sure,
start out with that?
Karen.
Okay, so as it turns out, the United States and China has a long relationship in terms of collaborating in agriculture, which began in the 1970s, before we even had an embassy in China. So we were sending groups of agricultural scientists from the United States to China, and groups of agricultural scientists from China were coming to the United States. So that relationship was actually negotiated by Henry Kissinger when Mao was the leader, and the farmers in China were still working in communes. So, you know, it's a very long and very productive relationship. One of the things that those exchanges opened up was it opened up trade. We went from zero trade with China on anything in 1970 to you know, millions of dollars of trade within 5 years, and 80% of this initial trade was in agricultural commodities. So agriculture really led the way in terms of opening up opportunities for the United States to sell things to China as soon as those doors opened up. And it was those agricultural scientists who were going back and forth that really informed the agricultural community in the United States and ag industry in the United States where the needs were and where the opportunities were. So it was a great first step. So when the administration changed in the late 1970s and Jimmy Carter became president, the Chinese were so excited about these agricultural opportunities that even though we didn't even have diplomatic relations yet, the liaison from China came to the Secretary of Agriculture and said, can we continue these exchanges? And they signed an agricultural understanding even before we had diplomatic relations, that we would continue to send agricultural scientists back and forth. So when the Science and Technology Agreement was signed in 1979, agriculture was one of the first parts of that. And for 35 years, we've been sending, exchanging groups of scientists. My first trip to China, I was part of one of those exchanges. So, so over those 35 years, 2,100 agricultural scientists from the United States have traveled to China, and about an equal number of Chinese have come to the United States. So we've really, increased our understanding of each other's agriculture and really opened the doors for agribusiness. Sadly, that started to, we started to pull away from each other starting in about 2018. And then when the pandemic came along, that really shut everything down. So we're real hopeful that we can start those exchanges again. And that would be, and there's so many important topics that we do not compete on. Things like, climate smart agriculture would be one of the great area for an exchange. Another great area for an exchange would be agricultural plastic, since we're going to be traveling to Shandong province. Shandong province has more greenhouses than anywhere else in the world. So they're the leaders in greenhouse technology. So if you want to expand your business interests in that particular area, that's definitely a place that you need to go.
Great, thank you. So the message I get is bring back the exchanges, right?
Well, that would
So,
be a first step, and that would be an easy first step. And I know that the agricultural scientists are very excited to start collaborating again, because we've really been cut off from each other for, more than just the pandemic. So to have that opportunity to be able to communicate and collaborate again.
Yeah, at this point, I'm really excited to actually share with you. I don't know if you know about this. Of the delegation when we're bringing to China this June, there's actually a subset of agriculture education delegation with about a dozen students and a dozen faculties. So they'll be in China actually for 2 weeks. So this is another thing that it's again engaging the next generation leaders. So another question is actually about the political environment we're in, right? And I think Jennifer touched on some of the tailwinds, headwinds, and I know, Karen, you mentioned the long history collaboration, but we're a little bit stuck in the moment right now. You hear a lot about security, national security, seeds, IP, and then, so what do you think are the tailwinds and headwinds for this Green Alliance to continue to thrive and then bring benefits to the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if as the climate, the U.S.-China Climate Working Group, I think they've been coming back together. Again, that's predominantly focused on energy, but methane is a major topic. So there a lot maybe on oil and gas, but that's kind of opened a door for more conversations. And keep in mind, as I said already, the relation, the scientists, I mean, when the political tensions are lower, that helps facilitate the scientific exchanges. Getting visas to also really help them do their exchanges. I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of talk. I live in DC, about the negativity towards China, and I saw that there was one question that was asking about Chinese owning. How can the cooperation happen if there are restrictions on Chinese ownership of land? Well, to be honest, China, there's almost no. I mean, the biggest owner of land, agricultural land, is Canada, not China. There's a super small amount, and for the kind of things that we're talking about, it's about scientific exchanges, policy, sharing best practices in terms of the no-till. I mean, the China, there are definitely people in China who have studied this, but some of the practices and things that and how to monitor this, how to create carbon trading. That's a huge interest in China. They've actually been the Xi administration has been doing a lot in terms of green financing for environment overall, trying to find ways to be creative. So there's an opportunity to talk about these kinds of things and lessons. And I've had people come and ask me about, well, can the US and China, can they take their, climate smart agriculture or practices, can it go to the global South? And I said, of course, there could be opportunities there. And it just, again, this isn't about, it's not, I mean, I think businesses may also cooperate, hard to say, but I know that in the energy front, well, how about plastic? This totally, I know that early on in COVID, when I was doing a lot of research on plastic, US-China kind of potential plastic waste collaboration, they actually found that quite a large number of US companies like Unilever and others were working with the Alibaba and the e-commerce companies there on how they could change their packaging, how they could be better at collecting it. And so we had companies cooperating on the waste issue because, again, these companies are becoming more and more global. And so you could almost envision that, I mean, food wastage wastage that happens as food is being processed. We haven't even dove into that yet. Someone asked a question about cold chain. Well, if when you harvest certain foods, it needs to get into those air-conditioned vans or trains and get a move on to the market. And if those aren't available, food can rot. But keep in mind, those air conditioning HFCs, another short-lived climate pollutant. We are planning to kind of, as we continue this work, to go down the supply chain, identify areas of cooperation, or where the tough points are. I think there's a big field where we can cooperate.
Great. I see a lot of questions popping up. Definitely feel free to scan through and pick anyone you want to address. There was a question about how is China evaluating the benefits of regenerative agriculture if there are related policy implementation. Are you aware of this, how China is adopting that or evaluating it as?
Well, we explored that when we were working on our report. We were looking at, we saw that, conservation agriculture, only 5% of agricultural land in China is under conservation agriculture. And what were some of the obstacles and some of the limitations? One of the biggest limitations is yield. If food security is one of your major drivers in terms of agricultural policy, any practice that could reduce yield is kind of a non-starter. So one of the challenges when you switch from conventional tillage to conservation tillage to no-till to those types of agricultural practices is at first you can experience perhaps a decline in yield. Now, over time, as your soil quality improves, you'll get that back. But at first, you might experience a reduction in yield. So there's a certain amount of reluctance to move to any type of an agricultural practice where yield will go down when when food security is really the driving policy. So that's been a real challenge for those who are promoting conservation agriculture. Other aspects of it is a lot of the agricultural practices that have been developed in China over thousands of years. We've only been farming in the United States for, a couple hundred years, where in China, they've been, growing food for, several thousand years on this land. So they have a lot more experience. And they developed a lot of pest and disease control practices before there were pesticides and herbicides available. And when you leave crop residue behind, that's a place that can harbor insects and disease. So a lot of the practices that they've developed over hundreds and hundreds of years are to remove that crop residue, burn it, using it in building materials. They have uses for all of that crop residue, but the whole idea of leaving that crop residue on the field is a whole new way of thinking. One of the people that we interviewed who works with the Nature Conservancy in China, she was talking about how when farmers were adopting conservation agriculture practices, their neighbors would look at them and say, "Oh, look at how messy their fields are. They are lazy farmers." And I've even talked to some of the agriculturalists in the United States, and they said, yes, indeed, when they first started adopting conservation agriculture in the United States, people were talking about, oh yeah, those are like trash farmers, and they were leaving all of this trash on the field, all this crop residue on the field. So it really is a very different way of farming, and there are some hurdles. When you're asking somebody to change the way that they do their business, that's asking a lot. So so a lot of the approaches are, making sure we have good research, and then having the opportunity for field demonstrations and for farmers to have a chance to see and learn about these new practices before they try to adopt them. When I talk to rice farmers in Arkansas about adopting some of these climate smart agricultural practices to grow rice, they have pretty big farms there. They have hundreds of acres. So they can set aside, maybe 10 acres or 20 acres and try a new agricultural practice. And if it works, great, maybe they'll expand it to their whole farm, Or if it doesn't, well, they haven't lost very much. But when your farm is only 1.5 acres, that's taking a very big risk. So we have to look at, different types of incentives and being cautious that you're not impacting yield.
So sounds like direct replication of policy approach may not be realistic given the different size of the farm and incentives, but actually calling out the areas where both sides can work on, it's already very helpful. I know you both are looking forward to going to China after a long pause. You'll be speaking at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Ellen from our team should share with you very soon the agenda. You'll see who's presenting from the Chinese side. But if you have any questions you came upon that you want to ask the Chinese side, I was just wondering, do you have what are some of the questions you like to learn more from the Chinese side when you to attend the think tank dialogue on the 12th?
Well, I mean, I'm really in, I mean, we've been talking, we've been Zooming Chinese, meeting, expanding our conversations in China, but I know that there are definitely a lot more people working on this because it's a very diverse sector. So, I mean, I'm really interested to see like what do they see, depending, what do they see as the priority, or is, depending who they are, maybe climate smart agriculture isn't a priority yet. I mean, I think it's in China, climate policy is still very heavily focused on the energy sector, power sector, cars. And that makes a lot of sense. But, the policy, the 30-60 policy, I mean, we're going carbon neutral, that agriculture, that at one point, the administration is going to pivot and look more heavily at the agricultural sector. And I think one thing that's could again be helpful related to what Karen was talking about is that like in the US are the partnerships for climate smart commodities, that in that a lot of these, these pilots are happening, it's giving subsidies, it's giving incentives, it's protection and insurance, because for that dip in ag output, it'll help people tide them over. And again, I think also that the interest, a lot of farmers in both the countries are interested in some of these, like maybe the carbon markets. And so, I mean, right now, I mean, another surprise I didn't mention earlier, I had no idea. Did you guys know that the California has a emission trading system? Well, for the past 10 plus years, they've had a voluntary market that has had dairy and rice farmers from around the country participating in, some US company, big company wants to get their net zero. They can buy carbon credits from farmers that are in Minnesota who are at a dairy, who are trying things to reduce the methane emission from their cows. I had no idea that was happening, but and that's just, I mean, it's a huge emission trading market, but I think that would be an example that, China has just about a year ago opened up their own voluntary market, and it includes agriculture. So stay tuned. Conversations are pending.
One of the
Great.
areas I want to learn more about is the food loss and waste. And what are taking a deeper dive into that and to look at where are the opportunities on farm to reduce food loss. And because our agriculture, if our agriculture production was the same, we wouldn't have as many opportunities to learn. But because it's so different, and our government policies are so different, we have the opportunity to try different things and see what works and see what doesn't. So I think that enhances our ability to learn from each other. If we were exactly the same, we wouldn't have this many opportunities to learn. So I want to learn more about food loss and waste. What are some of the issues and what are some of the potential solutions that the Chinese are working on?
And just
Great.
to kind
Yeah,
of to riff on someone asked a question about how bilateral cooperation between the two is a welcome development, and but like kind of want to know a little bit more why. And I think that I mean, for years, one reason that that my job at the Wilson Center has been a real happy space is that I have seen, my very first publication was called Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential, and I wrote in there, and that was from 2000, 2001. But I've seen over the years that on energy, environment, and now ag issues, that keeping communication channels open, it can have a stabilizing effect on the relationship. And I've seen, and I know that mean that in your work at the U.S. Heartland China Association, there's often very much a hunger of this exchanges at the subnational level. So yeah, I just find that they're interesting, they're good opportunities that
Yes.
one can explore. I mean, the Wilson Center for Nonpartisan Non-Advocacy, but in creating my platform for conversations, I mean, I told you about the ping pong before, so maybe we'll have an ag ping pong sometime soon.
Yeah, we definitely noticed that, again, the pandemic made it possible to accelerate the Zoom program. But we learned that the Chinese side and the US side are very eager to engage and learn from each other. But as people say, there's always things that lost in translation, even if you're talking. So when you're not going back and forth, you have a lot more that's in the gap in the knowledge of each other. So I'm really, really excited you're joining us to go to China in June. One last thing I'll mention is related to one of the questions, and I see a few people raise hands, is actually about the Chinese dietary changes. Because there are, in one of the think tank dialogue we hosted, one of the leading thinker from the CAS actually talked about how reevaluate the lifestyle choices Chinese people have, because traditionally they don't eat that much beef or animal protein like the Americans. When I was growing up, not many people drank milk. Cheese was very, maybe you get it when you go to Mongolia. So, but now a lot more Chinese have grown up with McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're getting used to having barbecue. There's a great barbecue place in Shanghai, Texas style. So there's this middle class that's with a global palate, but there's also a very strong push about living simple, vegetarian, the lower meat. So how did you see the consumer preference and the come to play in this space?
I think that, well, we didn't do deep dives into the consumer end, because we feel that that a lot of, when we looked at a lot of the numbers, a lot of the wastage, particularly like on food waste, happens further upstream. And we feel, but we do know that, I mean, China already has, and I mentioned that they have their anti-food waste law, Clean Your Plate campaign, which just makes so much sense. It's not, it's not telling people what to eat, but just don't waste it. And I think that, but the same thing for the United States. If we rein in our waste, I mean, there's a huge benefit for the farmer, waste and loss, because again, farmers lose income when they lose it up on the farm. So I think that that's an area, again, that I think that, and it's not, I mean, your countries all around the world have this challenge. So I think that's one thing that I was excited about, that it's made it up to the level of the global climate talks, bringing food waste on the table.
So one of the things I learned when I was studying the very early collaborations between the United States and China, when the first animal scientists from the United States went to China in the 1970s, was that they found that the aspirations and the goal of the Chinese way back in the 1970s was to double the amount of meat availability for their citizens. So this wasn't a new phenomenon. This isn't